There are empires that don't fall in fire. They don't end in revolution. They don't vanish on a single fateful day. They continue to exist but weaken year by year. The Habsburgs were one of them. For centuries, they ruled Europe not by a unified nation, but by bloodlines, marriages, and succession. Their power stretched from Central Europe to the Mediterranean, from thrones to meticulously written genealogies like sacred law. But in 1740, a single question was enough to plunge Europe into war. Who would inherit? This is not a story of collapse. This is a story of the price paid to continue to exist. In European history, few dynasties wielded power as both invisible and enduring as the Habsburgs. Not because they were always victorious on the battlefield, nor because they possessed a unified people or a common language, but because they held something else entirely: the power of succession. For centuries, the Habsburg strength was not forged in steel furnaces or measured by the number of soldiers, but sealed in marriages, recorded in genealogies, and protected by seemingly dry legal documents that were as powerful as any army. From the late Middle Ages, the Habsburgs learned a lesson that other dynasties often only learned at a high-priced territory: can be conquered by force, but lasting power must be legitimized. Each royal marriage was not merely a personal connection, but a geopolitical link. Over generations, these links overlapped and intertwined, forming a network of territories stretching from Central Europe to the Iberian Peninsula, from Italy to its overseas colonies. But this very power structure, built on paperwork and bloodlines, contained a fatal weakness. It depended absolutely on the continuity of blood. When power was not tied to a unified nation, but to a family, the question of who will inherit ceased to be an internal matter. It became a question for all of Europe, and whenever that question remained unanswered, war was not merely a possibility, it was almost inevitable. At the beginning of the 18th century, the Habsburg Empire entered a more fragile phase than ever before. The vast territories it held did not function as a unified entity. Each region had its own laws, its own nobility, and its own interests. The only thing holding them together was the recognition of the power of a single head of state. But what if that person's succession was in doubt? In the palaces of Vienna, that obsession never left the thick stone walls. The long corridors, where portraits of Habsburg ancestors hung from floor to ceiling, were not only symbols of past glory, but also reminders of the responsibility of succession. Every name, every crown, every marriage was carefully remembered, for a single broken link could cause the entire structure of power to collapse. Emperor Charles VII understood this better than anyone. He was not a great conqueror, nor a military genius, but he was the heir to a fragile legacy built over centuries. Charles VI's greatest problem lay not in the borders of the empire, but in his own family. He had no sons. In a political system where supreme power remained firmly tied to men, this was not merely a personal disadvantage. It was a potential crisis for all of Europe. To resolve this issue, Charles V gambled on a document he believed could overcome any conflict: the Edict on Practicality. This document was designed to ensure that his daughter, Maria Theresa, could inherit the entire Habsburg territory. But in the world of European dynasties, promises on paper only held value if they aligned with the interests of other great powers. Charles VI spent almost his entire reign persuading, bribing, and coercing European monarchies to recognize the edict. He believed that if the dynasties signed, they would keep their word. It was a legally binding belief, but history operates through power and chance. When Charles VI died, those signatures, once reluctantly placed, quickly lost their meaning. His death not only left a throne for Maria Theresa, but also opened a power vacuum that the European powers had long awaited. The War of Succession did not erupt out of personal vendetta, but from a combination of ambition, opportunity, and a system of succession designed to avoid conflict, but inadvertently inviting it. Each army that entered Habsburg territory carried the same argument: they were not invading. They were merely defending their legitimate interests. But behind those declarations lay a far more brutal reality, where lands became battlefields for disputes that the people themselves did not create. The War of Succession was not just a battle of dynasties. It was the moment when the entire model of European power, based on bloodlines, was tested to its limit. And the price of that test would not be paid in diplomatic documents, but in lives, resources, and a prolonged decline spanning generations. The rest of the story will not be just about battles or treaties. It will delve into how a succession crisis shook the European order, and how the Habsburgs, though they survived, paid a price that no legal document can conceal. When Charles VI died in the autumn of 1740, the silence that enveloped European palaces lasted only a brief moment. It was not a reverence for a deceased emperor, but a quietude of calculated maneuvering. Edicts once signed in peace were now scrutinized in the cold light of chance. The Edict of Practicality, the document Charles VI believed would secure the future of his dynasty, suddenly became a more fragile promise than ever before. Maria Theresa, then only 23 years old, ascended a throne not designed for a woman. She inherited not only a vast and fragmented empire, but also the suspicion of European courts. To many, she was not the legitimate successor, but a power vacuum veiled by law. In an international order where military power remained the ultimate measure, Maria Theresa's gender was seen as a structural weakness, a sign that the Habsburg dynasty was entering a period of decline. This skepticism quickly translated into action. Frederick Leto of Prussia, a young, intelligent, and ambitious monarch, saw the death of Charles VI as a historical opportunity. Silesia, a resource-rich and strategically valuable land, had long been on Prussia's radar. With a carefully constructed but opportunistic legal argument, Frederick claimed his legitimate right to the territory. In a short time, Prussian troops invaded Silesia, initiating a conflict whose scope was no longer under control. Remarkably, this invasion did not encounter immediate resistance from other powers. On the contrary, it created a chain reaction. Bavaria, France, and many other powers began to reconsider the commitments they had made to Charles VI. If part of the Habsburg Empire could be challenged without immediate consequences, why not the rest? The War of Austrian Succession did not erupt like a sudden storm, but like a series of spreading cracks in a structure already under too much pressure. While armies moved across the map of Europe, Maria Theresa faced a far harsher reality than legal arguments. She needed not only to defend her inheritance, but also to convince the diverse territories within the empire that she deserved their loyalty. In Hungary, support did not come from treaties, but from a deeply emotional and political appeal. When Maria Theresa appeared before the Hungarian parliament, cradling her infant child, the image was not merely symbolic. It was a survival strategy. She spoke not as an all-powerful emperor, but as a mother pleading for protection for her child and for the common heritage. That moment marked a crucial turning point. The Habsburgs, accustomed to power being recognized by default, were forced to learn to negotiate directly with the nobility and the territories. Loyalty was no longer a given. It had to be earned, sometimes with emotion, sometimes with concessions, and sometimes with blood. War spread not only across the great battlefields, but also into the lives of millions of people. Lands like Bohemia and Silesia became places where power was decided daily by the presence of different armies. Taxes soared to feed the war, crops were destroyed, and local communities were drawn into conflicts they had not initiated. For ordinary people, the question of the legitimacy of succession meant nothing. What they perceived was only prolonged instability and constant fear. In this context, the war was no longer simply a dynastic struggle. It became a test of the entire European political order. The great powers fought not only for territory, but for a deeper principle: whether power could continue to be passed down through bloodlines and legal documents, or whether it had to be reasserted by military force whenever the opportunity arose. Maria Theresa, despite being surrounded by hostile forces, did not fall as many predicted. But every decision she made carried a price. Every concession to maintain an ally, every military campaign to reclaim territory, depleted the empire's resources. The Habsburgs might still stand, but the foundations of their power were changing irreversibly. The Austrian succession struggle, from its early years, showed that the survival of the dynasty would no longer depend on strategic marriages or mere legal decrees. It would be determined by the ability to adapt to a changing Europe, where war became the common language of the great powers, and where the price of succession was paid in more than the throne. As the War of Austrian Succession entered its most brutal years, the map of Europe was no longer a static picture of borders, but a constantly moving plain, where each campaign season redrawn the lines of power with the smoke of gunfire and corpses. The initial invasions, once disguised by legal arguments and diplomatic pronouncements, now gave way to a far more stark reality: total war between great powers, involving unprecedentedly large armies and a level of destruction that previous generations could only vaguely imagine. On the battlefields of Bohemia and southern Germany, the Habsburg army faced an enemy not only superior in numbers, but also in organization and speed. The Prussian army, under the leadership of Frederick Pettu, operated like a machine tuned to a cold, ruthless standard. Infantry formations advanced in strict order, artillery was deployed with deadly effectiveness, and victories were achieved not only militarily but also symbolically. Each Habsburg defeat threatened not only a territory but also further eroded the prestige of the dynasty. But war was not confined to the vast plains where history typically records battles. It crept into small towns, villages, and even once thriving commercial centers. As armies passed through, They brought with them not only banners and discipline, but also looting, disease, and chaos. For civilians, the lines between ally and foe blurred. Any army could requisition food, occupy homes, and leave behind shattered communities. In Vienna, the Habsburg dynasty faced a bitter paradox. To sustain the war, they needed money, soldiers, and loyalty. But the war itself was depleting the resources they depended on. Taxes rose steadily, loans were signed on increasingly unfavorable terms, and the local nobility, who had once viewed Habsburg protection as the foundation of their status, began to question the cost. Every financial decision made in the closed chambers carried long-lasting consequences, not only for the dynasty, but for generations to come. Maria Theresa during these years was no longer the image of a young monarch seeking recognition. She became the center of a collective survival effort. Her letters to generals and local officials reveal an undisguised tension. She understood that each military defeat would not only result in the loss of territory, but would also encourage more rivals to join the war. In a Europe where opportunity arose from the weakness of others, maintaining an image of power became a vital necessity. The war also exposed the internal contradictions of the Habsburg Empire. Different territories reacted to the conflict in different ways. In some regions, loyalty was bolstered by fear of external forces. In others, particularly in areas heavily affected by the fighting, patience gradually ran out. People began to see the court not merely as a protector, but as a source of prolonged suffering. This created a deep rift in the relationship between the center of power and the peripheries. Meanwhile, international alliances were constantly shifting, reflecting a cold reality of 18th century politics. There were no permanent allies, only permanent interests. Treaties signed one year could be broken the following year, as the balance of power shifted. For the Habsburgs, this meant never a stable peace to rebuild upon. Each lull between campaigns was merely preparation for the next round of violence. The human cost of the war became increasingly apparent. Reports from the war zones described abandoned fields, empty villages, and desperate caravans of refugees. Casualty figures, however carefully documented, could not fully reflect the psychological and social loss. A generation raised in war learned to accept instability as the normal, and this left a deep mark on the structure of the empire. By the middle of the war, it was clear that whatever the outcome, the Habsburgs would never return to their pre-1740 state. The War of Succession was not merely a temporary test, but a painful transformation. It forced the dynasty to confront the limits of its model of power based on kinship and tradition. And in the process, the price paid was not only measured in territory or honor, but in the accumulated weariness of an entire society. Those years of conflict laid the groundwork for a larger question, one that would haunt the Habsburgs for decades to come. Could they reform to survive in a struggling Europe? As the most brutal years of the War of Austrian Succession drew to a close, an undeniable truth emerged in every corridor of power in Vienna. The Habsburg dynasty could not continue to exist relying solely on the outdated structures that had ensured its stability in the past. War had not only eroded territory and resources, but had also ruthlessly exposed the flaws of an empire built piecemeal over centuries. In this context, reform was no longer an ideal, but a matter of survival. Maria Theresa entered this period not as a defender of her inheritance, but as a ruler compelled to redefine the very foundations of her power. The war years had taught her that loyalty could not be demanded solely on tradition, and military strength could not be sustained if the state lacked the ability to mobilize resources effectively. The reforms she initiated were not the product of pure Enlightenment thinking, but a direct result of the pressures of war, of the constant threat that the empire could disintegrate without change. One of the first areas to be scrutinized was the administrative apparatus. Before the war, each Habsburg territory operated almost as a separate entity, with its own laws, taxes, and administrative systems. This had previously allowed the dynasty to maintain flexibility and compromise with local aristocrats, but in wartime, it became a burden. Mobilizing troops and finances was hampered by legal obstacles and vested interests. Maria Theresa realized that if central power was not consolidated, any future war would repeat the same difficulties. The process of centralizing power was slow and fraught with resistance. The aristocracy, accustomed to considerable autonomy, did not readily accept closer scrutiny from Vienna. But the war had weakened their negotiating position. With the external threat still present, arguments for traditional privilege gradually lost their persuasive power. The Habsburg state began building a more professional administrative apparatus, with well-trained officials accountable directly to the central government. This was not merely a technical change, but a profound shift in how power was exercised. Parallel to administrative reform was the restructuring of the army. Initial defeats at Prussia had shown that traditional discipline and personal loyalty were insufficient to confront a modernly organized adversary. The Habsburg army had to be retrained, re-equipped, and, more importantly, placed under a more unified command system. These military reforms consumed enormous resources, but they also created an armed force capable of responding more quickly and effectively in subsequent conflicts. Financial reforms were among the most painful areas. To support the army and the new administrative apparatus, the state needed a stable and predictable source of revenue. This meant expanding the tax base, not only relying on farmers and commoners, but gradually reaching previously exempt classes. This decision sparked discontent, but it also reflected a new understanding of the state's role. Power cannot exist without a proportionate contribution from all segments of society. These reforms, though coercive in many cases, began to change the relationship between the monarchy and its subjects. The Habsburg dynasty was no longer just a ruling family standing over fragmented territories, but gradually became a state entity with clearer responsibilities and obligations. However, this transition did not occur peacefully. It created new tensions, potential conflicts between the central and local governments, between tradition and innovation. The War of Austrian Succession, in this view, was not merely a conflict over succession. It was the catalyst for a profound restructuring process, where the Habsburg dynasty was forced to abandon parts of its old identity to adapt to a Europe entering an era of more centralized states. The price of this adaptation was not measured solely in money or political resistance, but in a fundamental change in how power was understood and exercised. As the flames of war subsided, A new Habsburg dynasty emerged, no longer as invincible as before, but also no longer as fragile as in the early years of Maria Theresa's reign. It was a dynasty that had learned the bitter lesson that survival did not come from promises on paper, but from the ability to transform itself under the pressures of history. As the final marches subsided and the cannons fell silent, Europe entered a period that, on the surface, was called peace. But for the Habsburgs, this tranquility did not bring a sense of victory. It felt more like a weary respite than a complete end. After nearly a decade of fighting, the War of Austrian Succession concluded with diplomatic treaties signed cautiously, where neither side truly achieved everything it desired, and neither was willing to acknowledge the true cost. For Maria Theresa, being officially recognized as the legitimate ruler of the Habsburg territories was a significant symbolic victory. What Charles VI had tried to secure in legal terms was finally accepted in practice. But that recognition did not come free. It came with a bitter truth that the dynasty could not avoid Silesia, once one of the economic pillars of the empire, no longer belonged to the Habsburgs. This loss was not merely a border adjustment. It was a clear sign that the balance of power in Central Europe had shifted permanently. Prussia's retention of Silesia legitimized its new status as a military power. Under Frederick II, Prussia not only demonstrated that it could challenge a long-established dynasty like the Habsburgs, but also showed that military effectiveness and modern state organization could transcend tradition and nominalism. For Vienna, this was a chilling warning. The Europe the Habsburgs had once dominated through intermarriage, and succession was giving way to a new order where power was measured by the ability to mobilize and sustain war. The peace treaty brought relative stability, but did not erase the deep scars left by the war. The empire's finances were strained to a dangerous degree, and the heavily affected territories would need years, even decades, to recover. More importantly, faith in the Habsburg dynasty's invincibility had been damaged. Allies now viewed Vienna with a more pragmatic eye, and rivals understood that the empire could be challenged, even forced to make concessions. However, peace also created a new space for self-reflection. Maria Theresa and her advisors looked back on the war not just as a series of failures and concessions, but as a life or death lesson. They realized that maintaining the empire in its old state of fragmentation would only lead to recurring crises. Reforms initiated during wartime were now being pushed forward in peacetime, with the goal of creating a state capable of defending itself against future challenges. On a deeper level, the War of Austrian Succession changed how people perceived power. Previously, the Habsburg dynasty was often seen as a nearly permanent entity, intrinsically linked to the natural order of Europe. After the war, that image was replaced by a more realistic perception: power is contested, lost, and must be maintained through continuous effort. This change did not happen overnight, but it subtly reshaped the relationship between state and society. The peace treaty did not erase the international tensions exposed during the war. On the contrary, it froze them in a fragile state. Unresolved grievances, unfulfilled ambitions, continued to exist beneath the diplomatic surface. For the Habsburgs, this meant that peace was not an end, but a lull before new challenges. The empire survived, but in a world where competition between great powers was increasingly fierce and less tolerant. The War of Austrian Succession, viewed from this perspective, appears more as a turning point than a single catastrophe. It marked the end of a long-held illusion that power could be secured solely by bloodline and law. At the same time, it ushered in a new era where the Habsburgs had to learn to survive in a more modern, dangerous, and demanding Europe, one that demanded more from those who sought to remain central. The terrible price of the War of Succession, therefore, lay not only in lost territories or mounting debts. It lay in the irreversible shift in the European political order, where the Habsburgs, from their position as an obvious pillar, became a power constantly forced to demonstrate their adaptability to the currents of history. When the treaties ending the War of Austrian Succession were sealed with seals and signatures, Europe entered a period that appeared outwardly more stable, but beneath the surface lay a profound shift in how dynasties understood power. For the Habsburgs, the post-war years did not resemble a complete recovery, but rather a protracted process of adaptation, where every decision was haunted by the memory of the fragility that had just been exposed. The Habsburg Empire survived the war, but it was no longer an entity based solely on historical prestige. The loss of Silesia not only diminished its economic resources, but also altered how Vienna was perceived internationally. Other powers no longer assumed that the Habsburgs would play a central role in any power arrangement. From that point on, their position had to be maintained through continuous reforms, flexible diplomacy, and a renewed awareness of the reality that war could break out whenever the balance of power shifted. The most important legacy of the War of Succession lies not in any specific provision, but in the lesson it left for all of Europe. Power, now, was no longer seen as something that could be safely passed down through bloodlines and legal documents. It became a process, a state that had to be maintained through administrative capacity and the ability to mobilize society. In this context, the Habsburgs were compelled to continue the path of reform that had begun in the flames of war, even if it meant eroding the privileges that had defined their dynasty. The post-war years saw the rise of a new type of state, where the administrative and military apparatus were more tightly organized, and where the role of the central government increasingly overshadowed local autonomy. For the Habsburgs, this was a process that was both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because without it, the empire would be unable to confront increasingly effective rivals. Dangerous because each step of centralization created resistance, and each reform carried the risk of shaking the already fragile consensus among the diverse territories. The physical space of power also reflected this transformation. Palaces once built as symbols of continuity and eternity now held a different meaning. At Hofburg Palace, royal ceremonies continued, but behind the solemn facade lay a state apparatus being restructured to meet the new demands of the times. Architecture did not change overnight, but the function of power within those stone walls had changed. It relied less on tradition and more on efficiency. The War of Austrian Succession also left an even more dangerous legacy. It prepared the ground for larger conflicts. The lessons learned from this war, both in military tactics and state organization, were quickly applied in subsequent confrontations. Europe entered a new cycle of great power competition, where wars were no longer isolated regional conflicts, but gradually expanded in scale and intensity. In this context, the Habsburgs were both learners and victims of the very new rules they were forced to accept. At the societal level, the memory of the War of Succession continued to shape the psychology of subsequent generations. Communities devastated by the conflict did not easily forget the prolonged instability, and faith in the monarchy's ability to protect them was no longer absolute. This created a spiritual distance between the center of power and the people, forcing the state to seek new forms of legitimacy, not solely based on bloodline, but on promises of order, security, and effective governance. Looking back from the perspective of historical distance, the War of Austrian Succession emerges as a quiet but decisive turning point. It didn't destroy the Habsburg dynasty, but it stripped it of its naivety regarding the nature of power. Following the war, the Habsburgs found themselves in a world where complacency was no longer an option, and where each ruling generation faced the question the War of Succession had cruelly posed: would power be maintained by tradition, or by the ability to adapt to the ever-changing course of history? As the direct memory of the War of Austrian Succession faded from the lived experience of those who had taken up arms, its legacy did not diminish. On the contrary, it permeated the power structure and political psychology of the Habsburg dynasty, becoming a foundational memory that governed major decisions for decades to come. The empire remained firmly rooted on the map of Europe, but its existence was now linked to a new awareness: there was no guarantee of the future without the continuous consolidation of power through reform and checks and balances. Maria Theresa, in the final years of her reign, ruled not merely as a survivor of a crisis, but as a ruler who had witnessed firsthand the price of slow adaptation. The reforms she initiated continued to spread, not out of abstract ideals, but because they were seen as the only defense against a repeat of a similar catastrophe. The Habsburg state, under the influence of wartime memory, became more vigilant, more focused, and less tolerant of anything perceived as a threat to the integrity of the empire. The next generation grew up in the shadow of that war. For them, the War of Succession was no longer a series of specific battles, but a lesson passed down through documents, reforms, and even through the organization of daily life. When power was transferred to Joseph II, the spirit of forced reform became even more apparent. Joseph II did not directly experience the chaotic early years of the War of Succession, but he inherited a dynasty already shaped by it. The urgency in his policies, from administration to social, reflected a deep-seated fear that any stagnation could lead to weakness, and weakness in the post-war world meant being challenged. The lasting legacy of the War of Succession, therefore, lies not only in specific institutional changes, but in a spiritual shift. The Habsburgs no longer viewed power as a natural inheritance, but as a heavy responsibility to be protected by relentless action. This created a dynasty that was both more dynamic and more tense. Each new reform carried the hope of consolidating power, but at the same time widened the gap between the central government and communities that felt compelled to change. At the European level, the Habsburgs' role after the War of Succession became more pragmatic. They were no longer the obvious pillar of the continental order, but a power that had to constantly negotiate its position among rising rivals. The rivalry with Prussia, initiated and legitimized in the War of Succession, continued to shape Central European politics for decades. Subsequent conflicts bore the clear imprint of the lessons learned: no victory is final, and no peace treaty can completely eradicate the seeds of war. Within the empire, the memory of the War of Succession created a constant sense of fragility. The diversity of languages, laws, and traditions, once seen as sources of soft power, was now viewed as a challenge to governance. A more centralized state was built to address this challenge, but at the cost of the gradual erosion of the natural bonds between the dynasty and its subjects. Stability was no longer achieved based on traditional consensus, but on the ability to control and coordinate. Looking back at the entire process, the War of Succession in Austria does not appear as a single tragedy in Habsburg history, but as a defining event. It did not destroy the dynasty, but it forced them to abandon the illusion of unconditional permanence. From that point on, each generation of Habsburg rulers faced the same question posed in the flames of 1740: how to survive in a Europe where power was never given for free, and where the price of succession was always more than a throne. As history gradually moved away from the tumultuous years of the War of Austrian Succession, the story of the Habsburg dynasty did not end in collapse, nor did it conclude in glorious victory. It ended in a far more complex state. Existence was preserved, but the price paid was permanently etched into the power structure, political memory, and consciousness of the entire empire. What the Habsburgs retained after the war was not their former integrity, but a new version of themselves, forged in loss and the constant fear of fragility. The War of Succession did not destroy the Habsburg dynasty in the way later revolutions would have destroyed other dynasties. It did not overthrow the throne, nor did it erase the ruling bloodline. But precisely because of this, its impact was deeper and more lasting. Instead of a moment of clear collapse, the Habsburgs had to live with a slow decline of the assumptions that had supported their power. The notion that history was on their side, that bloodlines and traditions were sufficient to guarantee the future, was irreversibly taken away by the War of Succession. The most terrible price of the war was not the loss of Silesia or the financial debts that dragged on for decades. It was the change in how power was perceived. After the war, every court decision carried the haunting specter of a recurrence of crisis. This vigilance helped the empire survive longer, but at the same time made power heavier and less flexible spiritually. The state grew stronger, but the natural links between the dynasty and the diverse communities within the empire became more strained. The War of Succession also left a bitter lesson about the limits of reform. Changes driven by crisis may save a dynasty in the short term, but they cannot completely eliminate internal contradictions. The Habsburgs entered the post-war period with a more efficient state apparatus, but also with a society increasingly aware of the price they had paid for the empire's existence. The stability achieved was no longer a matter of course, but the result of a delicate balance between control and acceptance. More broadly, the War of Austrian Succession marked a turning point in European history. It signaled the end of a period where dynastic power could rely primarily on the legitimacy of succession, and ushered in an era where administrative, military, and financial capabilities became the deciding factors. The Habsburgs were not excluded from this new order, but they no longer held an obvious central position. They became part of a continuous competition, where each generation had to reprove its right to exist. Looking back at the whole story, the War of Austrian Succession emerges as an uncompromising test. It posed the Habsburgs a question history has always posed to great powers. Is mere existence sufficient? Or does power need a deeper meaning to be sustained? The Habsburgs' answer was not a complete victory, but a prolonged, exhausting, yet necessary adaptation. And it was in this adaptation that the true legacy of the War of Succession was formed. Not a territory, a treaty, or a single victory, but a shift in how power perceived itself. The Habsburgs continued to exist for many generations, but since this war, they never again ruled with the impartiality of those who believed history would automatically be on their side. The terrible price of the War of Succession, ultimately, was the loss of that belief, and the beginning of an era where power had to live with the fear of its own end. Following the conclusion of the War of Austrian Succession, Europe witnessed not only a territorial adjustment, but also the clear emergence of two opposing power structures. The Habsburgs and the Kingdom of Prussia, who had clashed directly on the battlefield, now offered two different answers to the same historical question: how could a state survive and expand in a world where war was no longer the exception, but the constant state of affairs? For the Habsburgs, the War of Succession was a cruel wake-up call. The dynasty emerged from the conflict with an empire that remained vast and diverse, yet also fractured. Their power was deeply rooted in history, accumulated over centuries of marriage, inheritance, and compromise. After the war, that model did not disappear, but it was forced to adapt to survive. The Habsburg state could not become a purely military machine like Prussia, for its very nature did not allow it. They ruled a complex political space, where each territory had its own memory, laws, and loyalty. In contrast, Prussia emerged from the war with a confirmed identity. Holding Silesia was not merely a territorial victory, but proof that a smaller, less traditional, yet tightly organized state could challenge and surpass a long-established empire. Under Frederick II, Prussian power was defined not by bloodline or ritual, but by effectiveness. The state existed to sustain the army, and the army existed to protect and expand the state. This relationship was clear, cold, and consistent. The difference between these two models is evident in their perspectives on war. For Prussia, war was a legitimate political tool, meticulously prepared and used strategically. For the Habsburgs, war was a threat that had to be managed, an instability that could shake the fragile balance between territories. Following the War of Succession, Vienna did not seek to become a more aggressive power, but rather a state capable of withstanding war without collapse. This led to a profound contrast in power structures. Prussia centralized power with a speed and scale that the Habsburgs could not fully replicate. The Prussian apparatus was lean, disciplined, and clearly military-oriented. Meanwhile, the Habsburgs built an increasingly professional administrative apparatus, yet one that still had to reconcile with the local aristocracy and traditions. Their power was therefore more negotiated, more flexible, but also slower to react. After the war, Europe began to view these two powers through two different lenses. Prussia was seen as the embodiment of a militarized future, where efficiency and discipline could compensate for size and tradition. The Habsburgs, conversely, were seen as a power undergoing self-reconstruction, attempting to integrate the past with the new demands of the times. This comparison wasn't always advantageous to Vienna, but it reflected a deeper reality. The Habsburgs weren't seeking absolute dominance, but rather enduring survival. The rivalry between these two models wasn't confined to diplomatic chambers or battlefields. It permeated how other dynasties considered their future. Some looked to Prussia and saw the path of radical centralization and total militarization. Others looked to the Habsburgs and saw a different lesson, that a diverse empire could only survive if it embraced change without completely dismantling its existing social structure. The War of Austrian Succession, in light of this comparison, appears as the moment when European power split into two trajectories. One trajectory toward an efficient warrior state, willing to trade social flexibility for military might. The other toward a more complex, slower-paced, but more resilient state capable of absorbing shock without immediate collapse. Prussia chose the first path. The Habsburgs, though not entirely willingly, were forced to follow the second. This difference explains why, after the War of Succession, Prussia continued its rapid rise, while the Habsburgs maintained their position through persistence rather than breakthroughs. Neither model was perfect. The Prussian model generated formidable power, but also sowed the seeds of perpetual conflict. The Habsburg model preserved diversity and continuity, but accepted the persistent tension between the central and peripheral powers. Ultimately, the comparison between the Habsburgs and Prussia after the War of Succession does not reveal an absolute winner. It illustrates two different understandings of power in a Europe undergoing transformation. One side believed in discipline and efficiency as the foundation of the future. The other believed in adaptability and resilience as conditions for long-term survival. And it is in this parallel that 18th century Europe entered a new era where war not only determined who won, but also shaped how states understood themselves. If the War of Austrian Succession was the moment Europe realized that dynastic power was no longer guaranteed by bloodline, then the 7 Years' War was the inevitable consequence of that realization. Between the two conflicts, there was no clear dividing line, but rather an accumulation of resentment, calculations, and coldly learned military lessons. The treaties ending the War of Succession only froze the conflict in a temporary state. They did not resolve the core issue that had been exposed: the life or death competition between rising powers and empires forced to adapt to survive. For the Habsburgs, the War of Succession left behind a strategic objective never explicitly stated, but always present in every plan. Silesia had to be reclaimed. That land held not only economic value, but also symbolized a damaged reputation. Accepting the loss of Silesia in the peace treaty was a tactical concession, not a strategic resignation. In the meeting rooms of Vienna, the memory of the defeat at the hands of Prussia was not buried, but preserved as a constant reminder of what would have happened if reforms had stopped too soon. Meanwhile, Prussia entered the post-war period with a confidence forged by victory. The hold on Silesia not only strengthened its position, but also confirmed the effectiveness of its militarized state model. Frederick understood that his victory did not make Prussia any safer in the long run. On the contrary, it placed the kingdom at the heart of suspicion and hostility. Each year of post-war peace was therefore used to prepare for a larger conflict, where Prussia would have to confront not only the Habsburgs, but a broader coalition. This preparation did not take place in a vacuum. Other European powers also drew their own lessons from the War of Succession. France realized that containing the Habsburgs was no longer enough to protect its interests, and that the rise of Prussia could disrupt the order it had relied on. Britain, with its increasingly global vision, saw in continental conflicts an opportunity to restructure the balance of power in its favor. Old alliances began to loosen, and new alliances, once considered utopian, gradually became feasible. The War of Austrian Succession, therefore, not only created the Habsburg-Prussian rivalry, but also shook the entire European alliance system. It demonstrated that diplomatic commitments could be broken when strategic interests shifted. Flexibility, even ruthless pragmatism, in diplomacy became the new norm. In this context, the 7 Years' War did not erupt as a sudden event, but as the culmination of a power restructuring process that had begun in 1740. What made the 7 Years' War different, and even more dangerous, was the scope it inherited from the War of Succession. The military and administrative reforms, spurred in the previous war, now allowed the great powers to mobilize resources on an unprecedented scale. The war was no longer confined to a single region or a specific succession target. It expanded to multiple fronts, from Europe to overseas colonies, reflecting a world where power was more closely intertwined than ever before. For the Habsburgs, entering the 7 Years' War carried a cold but inevitable logic. If the War of Succession had proven that existence could be challenged, then the new war would determine whether subsequent reforms would be sufficient to reverse the tide. Their involvement was no longer purely defensive, but an attempt to reassert their position in a rewritten European order. In retrospect, the Austrian Succession War appears as the unofficial opening chapter of the 7 Years' War. It created new fault lines, new feuds, and new power structures that the subsequent war only deepened. Without the Succession War, the 7 Years' War could hardly have unfolded on such scale and intensity. And it is in this continuity that history shows that wars rarely stand alone. They follow one another, nourish each other, and together shape an era. In diplomatic documents and dynastic chronicles, the War of the Austrian Succession is often depicted with shifting borders, signed treaties, and abstract strategic decisions. But beyond those maps and royal seals, the war existed in a different, more insidious and prolonged form. It lived on in the lives of people who were never consulted, yet who bore the longest-lasting consequences. For ordinary people in border regions like Bohemia, Moravia, or Silesia, war did not come as a single event, but as an endless, protracted state. Armies passed through indiscriminately in the complex succession disputes. They saw villages, food, and manpower essential for sustaining the march. Each campaign season was a disruption of the order of life. Farmlands were abandoned, livestock were confiscated, and once closely knit communities were forced to disperse for survival. The War of Succession not only deprived people of tangible possessions, but also stripped them of their sense of security. A generation growing up in this context learned to live with insecurity as a natural part of life. Questions of succession, central to the conflict, became meaningless in the face of daily survival needs. For them, which dynasty ruled was less important than whether there would be enough food for the next harvest, and whether their village would survive after the armies withdrew. Soldiers, mobilized to execute strategic decisions, also lived in a reality far removed from the praises of honor and duty. Most were not professional warriors in the modern sense, but farmers and craftsmen pulled from their familiar lives to serve a war whose cause they did not fully understand. The increasingly strict military discipline reflected the authorities' anxieties about desertion and internal instability. In the barracks, disease and shortages killed just as many as enemy bullets. For the Habsburg soldiers, the War of Succession added another layer of psychological pressure. They fought not only to defend territory, but to maintain the existence of a challenged dynasty. But the abstractness of that goal could hardly comfort them on cold nights, when death came from starvation and exhaustion, rather than from major battles. Many returned home with crippled bodies, carrying the memory of a war where tangible rewards were almost non-existent. Between these two worlds, the petty nobility and local officials stood in a contradictory position. They lacked the power to shape major policies, yet they were the ones responsible for implementing them. War forced them to balance loyalty to the court and duty to their local community. Each tax increase, each conscription, put them at risk of losing the support of the very people they lived among. This tension gradually eroded their social standing, which was based on trust and familiarity. In many cases, the minor nobility became a buffer absorbing conflict between the central government and the people. They were seen as representatives of a distant power, even as they themselves suffered economic and psychological losses from the war. After the war, many families in this class never regained their former status. Accumulated debts, damaged social relationships, and a feeling of abandonment by both the court and the community created a quiet but deep-seated discontent. The War of Succession, therefore, not only reshaped power at the top of society, it restructured life at every level in ways that were difficult to reverse. Post-war administrative and military reforms, while aimed at stabilization, were built upon the foundation of human sacrifices that had preceded them. For many, a stronger state did not equate to a better life, but rather to a new, more effective, yet more distant form of control. Looking back from a human perspective, the War of Austrian Succession appears not as an abstract dispute over succession, but as a series of disruptions in daily life. It leaves scars that are not fully documented in history books, but persist in collective memory. And it is these scars that remind us that the terrible price of war is never paid only at the negotiating table or on a map, but in each small life swept along by the currents of history. Looking back at the War of Austrian Succession from a historical perspective, what stands out most is not the battles or the terms of the treaty, but a paradox that has persisted for generations. The Habsburgs survived. Their dynasty did not collapse in 1740, was not erased from the map of Europe, and did not become a memory that ended abruptly in tragedy. But this very survival conceals a far more difficult truth to accept. Since the War of Succession, the Habsburgs have never truly recovered their former power. The War of Succession saved the dynasty from immediate disintegration, but it did so by forcing the Habsburgs to abandon the very foundations that had once made them so secure. Their power, based on the legitimacy of succession, the network of marriages, and the almost implicit recognition of Europe, was fundamentally undermined by the war. After 1748, no one took Habsburg power for granted anymore. Every alliance, every treaty, every reform took place against the backdrop of having to re-demonstrate the necessity of the dynasty itself. The long-term decline of the Habsburgs did not stem from a single defeat, but from a chain of cumulative consequences. The loss of Silesia not only damaged the economy, but also shattered the sense of invincibility that had protected the dynasty from external challenges. The rise of Prussia created a lasting counterweight in Central Europe, forcing the Habsburgs to share the power space they had previously almost exclusively controlled. From that point on, all of Vienna's strategies were more reactive than proactive. The far-reaching post-war reforms, while making the state more efficient, also came at a significant political and social cost. The Habsburgs survived thanks to centralization, thanks to an increasingly tight administrative and military apparatus, but this very process eroded the soft ties that had bound the empire's diverse territories together. Loyalty no longer stemmed from tradition or a sense of belonging, but increasingly from obligation and coercion. It was a more stable foundation in the short term, but more fragile in the long run. The War of Succession also placed the Habsburgs on an irreversible historical trajectory. Each subsequent ruling generation had to devote much of its energy to maintaining internal balance and dealing with external challenges, rather than shaping the European order to its liking. The dynasty continued to exist, but in the role of a defensive power, constantly fearing that any delay or mistake could pave the way for a new crisis. On a deeper level, the War of Succession altered how the Habsburgs understood themselves. From a ruling family believing that history was on their side, they became a dynasty constantly aware of its potential for decline. This mindset spurred reform, but also created a prolonged defensive posture where innovation was always hampered by the fear of losing control. Survival, therefore, was accompanied by a constant sense of insecurity, silently shaping every decision, big or small. From a broader perspective, the fate of the Habsburgs after the War of Succession reflects a familiar rule of the history of power. Empires rarely collapse at the first test. They usually survive by adapting, but this adaptation reveals new limitations. The Habsburgs were not destroyed by the War of Succession, but they were forced into an era where power was no longer given to those who relied solely on the past. The Austrian War of Succession, therefore, was not the end of the Habsburg dynasty, but the beginning of a prolonged, slow, and paradoxical decline. This dynasty continued to exist for almost 2 more centuries, but since that war, they never again ruled with the absolute confidence of those who believed themselves to be the irreplaceable pivot of Europe. The terrible price of the War of Succession, ultimately, was not just what the Habsburgs lost, but what they were forced to become in order to continue to exist.